Although the arcade series wouldn't be released until 1986, with Pinball, we get a little taste of what's to come. Tabletop pinball had become popular around 40 years prior to the NES game's release, with the invention of the modern pinball machine. One of the main draws of home video game consoles was the ability to bring the arcade to your own living room. As such, the tried and true arcade experience of pinball was an obvious choice when deciding the best games to bring to early consoles. However, the physical nature of the game was quite difficult to accurately simulate in an electronic setting. While there were a few attempts at this in the 70s, including Atari's Video Pinball, which, like many other Atari games, looks laughably bad, the real breakouts occurred in the early 80s. Most notable of these was Pinball for the Intellivision and Pinball Construction Set developed by LucasArts for the Apple II, both released in 1983. Although its graphics were rudimentary, Intellivision's take on the game was still significantly more detailed than anything that came before it. Pinball Construction Set, as previously talked about, took this idea to a whole new level by allowing the player to create and edit their own stages. 1 year after these hit the market, the Famicom put out its own pinball title, aptly named Pinball. The game of pinball transcends cultural barriers and has always been appreciated by Americans in their arcades, so bringing it over to the States was a no-brainer. The actual name of Nintendo's game wasn't the most interesting, but we mustn't judge a book by its cover. So, what's the deal with Pinball? Pinball was the very first game to be developed by HAL Laboratories, though it was published by Nintendo. Although HAL was their own company, they worked quite closely with Nintendo, publishing 4 of the 30 black box games, including Golf and the 1986 titles Balloon Fight and Mach Rider. Notably, the former president of Nintendo, Satoru Iwata, was a head programmer on every one of these games, as he recalled in a 1999 interview. There have been many people that have covered the life and accomplishments of Iwata, so I'll leave that for them to explain, and I have linked a few notable ones in the description below. Out of the HAL-developed games that were released for the Famicom and NES, Pinball certainly seems to be the most lacking in scope. The game functions perfectly fine and is, technically speaking, a huge step up from all other pinball video games that had previously come out. Gameplay-wise, it functions exactly as pinball should. There are 2 screens that the ball goes down through, acting as a top and bottom portion of the cabinet. There's also a bonus stage that pays homage to Atari's Breakout and features Mario and Pauline, known from their exploits in Donkey Kong. If Mario breaks through the blocks holding Pauline and catches her, she safely makes her way off-screen, rewarding the player with bonus points. Pinball is also chock full of little details, helping to give the game a certain charm. For example, if the player reaches a score of 100,000 points, the flippers would turn invisible, giving them more of a challenge. Even though there's nothing here that's groundbreaking by today's standards, for the time it was just about the best pinball simulation one could hope to get without setting foot in an actual arcade. It's also probably important to mention the fact that HAL's Pinball would lay the groundwork for several future projects of the company. Nearly all of these were later published by Nintendo, leading me to believe that pinball had an impact not just confined to the realm of video game design. HAL ended up developing just about every pinball-related title for Nintendo up until around 2003. This includes Kirby's Pinball Land and Pokemon Pinball, although HAL did also produce Pinball Spectacular for the Commodore 64. The impacts of this original Famicom release could be felt in each of these games. The multi-screened action was also present in each of the aforementioned titles, although with notable improvements to the base formula. Kirby's Pinball Land actually featured 3 vertical screens with tons of variation and was incredibly detailed for a Game Boy game. Data compression was one of Iwata's specialties. He was able to cram all 18 holes into the black box title Golf, and later fit 2 entire regions into the games of Pokemon Gold and Silver, which was thought of as impossible at the time. So it's no surprise that, with his help, HAL games were able to hit new highs in the respective fields. Nonetheless, it's not too much of a stretch to infer that HAL reused their old physics engines for these updated titles. After all, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. A good portion of Nintendo's early relationship with HAL had to do with developing third-party titles for popular Nintendo IPs. Their masterful production of Pinball could have been a real boon for the company, and part of the reason why Nintendo decided to work with them at first. I can't find any first-party sources that confirm this, but this conclusion isn't much of a stretch when you take a look at the amount of pinball games they developed for Nintendo over the years. Other pinball games on the NES quickly outclassed the original launch title in detail and concept. 1989's Pinball Quest was a new take on the original, featuring seamless transitions between screens and interesting combat with medieval creatures. Although a little later, Sega's Sonic Spinball was another notable pinball title and what amounted to Sega's direct competition with Nintendo in the field. I would argue, however, that HAL nailed the controls and physics a lot better than their competitors. Although HAL and Nintendo's Pinball may not have lasted that long in the public sphere, it is a perfectly acceptable title to pick up and play for a few minutes here and there. Because of this, it's been ported to every Nintendo eShop thus far, and even had a cameo in Animal Crossing for GameCube. As with the more popular black box titles, it was included in the lineup of e-reader cards released during Nintendo's 2003 attempt to bring its customers back to their roots. Pinball's legacy has certainly been felt in the over 35 years since its original release. It's a solid title that earned its spot on the 1985 launch lineup.